trauma, when left untreated, has the capacity to make a villain out of you. Nikita Gill.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. We're talking today about blunt force trauma, which is the baseball bat or similar type of death. This one is best known for its surviving victims having a very different personality change. That's why we had this particular quote, because it can completely upend who a person is at their core if it's done in a certain way.
So you will often have heard of the results of this as a traumatic brain injury, and there's been a lot of discourse on it, especially in the professional sports arenas, particularly football, the effect of a consistent, repeated blunt force trauma to the head, and the effects it can have on the brain and personalities afterwards.
The distinction between this and the other types of murder that we've talked about this month is that blunt force trauma doesn't usually puncture the skin. And if it does, it's because of a whole bunch of back pressure being built up because of blood and swelling and other things, but it's not a sharp object.
So this is where you will hear the term laceration in crime shows. Laceration is when that skin breaks, but it's a result of blunt trauma. So the skin, rather than being sliced, is kind of ripped apart and torn. So it's usually jagged, and often there's some debris left behind.
So there are three basic categories we're going to be talking about, and this is just a way to think about how it happens to your character. It's not by any means perfectly clear lines. That is the person colliding with a thing, falling from a great height, that type of thing. The thing colliding with a person, so a sling stone, or somewhere in between, where they just get jostled around.
So when it comes to a person colliding with a thing, this can be caused by someone else. Just take a look at John Wick and how often he smashes guys' heads into things. So it was a person colliding with the thing, but not of their own volition.
And when you hear about people falling out of airplanes or jumping off of buildings, these kind of things, this falls into this particular category because they're good, and then they're squished. There is a blunt force, not something sharp, traumatizing the body as a whole.
Now, when a thing collides with the person, this is what you're most likely going to hear about when it comes to blunt force trauma. This is getting hit in the head with a baseball bat or a golf club or a trophy or a flower vase or a beer bottle or whatever, using an object to hit somebody over the head.
I also put things like being trampled under horses in this category, mostly because if we're thinking about it in gaming terms, the first one was a con check, can you take the hit? This one is more of a dex check, can you get out of the way before it hits you?
And then the somewhere in between category, this is when the two objects are moving towards each other. So your football collisions that cause concussions, or airbags in a vehicle collision, your face is moving towards it at the same time the airbag explodes and hits you.
A lot of explosions, the damage isn't necessarily shrapnel and that kind of thing, but it's this concussive force from air being pushed away from the center of explosion very quickly, picks up and throws your character across the room.
So what actually happens to the body with blunt force trauma?
The biggest thing that you're going to see is that internal bleeding. Something gets cut open inside the body, not necessarily on the outside. It ruptures something. And then you get all of this bruising, you'll get maybe damage to the gut, and so you'll start getting bleeding throughout other orifices.
When there's blunt force trauma to the head, you will have brain damage. It's almost guaranteed that you will have some kind of brain damage. It may not be that long-lasting TBI issue, but most of the time when blunt force trauma is fatal is because it damaged the head and neck area. It's just a very fragile place when it comes to the force behind blunt force trauma.
This is also the type of hit that has those personality changes that we were talking about earlier. The last possible thing that could happen that would end up killing your person is the impact itself hits a vital organ, and then the organ stops functioning as it should. This is especially prevalent in hollow organs, things like lungs and stomachs and intestines, these kinds of things, because they can get folded in and then not pop back into place correctly, and then they're deformed for a long time and it never heals properly.
In more fantasy, sci-fi realms, there's that common, if you strike somebody's chest in just the right place over their heart, you can basically stop their heart with a single hit. That kind of idea.
If it's an accidental blunt force trauma, which we'll get into in a moment, 3/4 of the blunt force traumas out there do happen in the abdomen area. They happen around the gut and perhaps the solar plex torso area.
Which is probably a good thing because that's where you're most protected, like with that kind of force, because there's a lot of things for it to jiggle and bounce off of, at least if you're built like me.
Now, if we're looking at the personality of the killer, this one is especially popular for the I accidentally killed this person and now it's a part of my tragic backstory. Where he was trying to fight me, he was trying to strangle me, this and that, and then I just ripped him off of me and threw him against the staircase banister. His temple hits the edge of the stair, and I didn't mean for him to die, but he's dead now, and it's this guilt that I carry for the rest of my life.
Yeah. These types of injuries tend to leave a lot of evidence behind. There's usually some kind of fracture if it encountered a bone, especially in particular the skull. There's going to be internal bleeding and potentially organ damage. There will be those lacerations that I mentioned earlier, where it hit with such force in a particular spot that it actually tore open the skin.
This is also a great indicator for how old the wound was when they died. Something like when your detective character is talking about noticing defensive wounds. You see these wounds of the bruising and the body trying to heal before the death blow actually lands. So there is a lot of evidence as far as timeline in this particular type of injury.
And they can tell a lot about what weapon was used by that shape and damage that was done in the process. Does it look like it was a hammer? Does it look like the edge of a coffee table or a banister? It can leave impressions behind when they hit.
And because of the nature of this, it's very rarely going to be an empty hand. And even if it is, there's evidence on the hands of the combat. So there's almost always evidence after the fact. You'll find that shattered vase. You'll find the hammer in the living room where it doesn't belong. These kinds of things, which makes it great for a murder mystery.
Another thing to consider when it comes to the kind of person who would use blunt force trauma, it allows them to stay in that personal range, but they may be looking for an advantage, a step up above their opponent in some way. They want to be just maybe a little bit more distanced, say with like a baseball bat, or they're using whatever is on hand to defend themselves, or they just want it to be quieter because guns are loud.
This tends to be the characters who are not good at this, the characters who are doing it for the first time, the ones who aren't enjoying it. They are used to swinging a hammer, so swinging it on a person is a lot easier than watching the light drain from their eyes. They're used to swinging a golf club, baseball bat, these kinds of things. They don't want to feel it. There's a physical object in between. It takes the damage, and so there's a little bit of emotional distancing that can happen with that.
Now, the historical context of blunt force trauma goes back a really long time.
You'll have that David and Goliath, that sling stone hitting the temple just in the right spot. That wasn't a sharp thing. And it hit the head in just the right spot where it shut down the brain function, and he just went blue, poof.
Now, in more recent history, you also have somebody like Richard III, who is my kingdom for a horse guy, who was killed in part by a halberd, in part by being underfoot of a horse.
For the record, the My Kingdom for a Horse, that comes from Shakespeare, but dude actually did die by being trampled during a battlefield.
It seems very Shakespeare to do.
Yes. One thing that I found interesting was the oldest murder that we have in the scientific record, which is 430,000 years ago, shows that 2 blows to the head were probably what killed this guy. So blunt force trauma, classic from the very beginning.
And then a common Native American weapon was a ball club, war club that kind of looks like a femur with a ball joint on the end that had both ceremonial and political and war uses, and were sometimes believed to carry supernatural power within them. I think the first time I ever saw this was actually in the movie Pocahontas.
So if you're looking for a way to give your character a good traumatic backstory without making them feel like they're a victim all the time, this might be something to consider if they accidentally killed someone, especially because blunt force trauma is great for having lingering effects, even if the person doesn't survive. And if they do, there's that personality flip that they then have to deal with for a long time. If your character is a little more caring, a little more innocent, and did the right thing and defended themselves, this is a great type of murder to keep in mind. So think about how you would approach the same situation with your characters and how you as a detective might approach the same situation, and you might find blunt force trauma will serve you well. And when you do that,
Write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.